Okay.
Yep. Thank you. Right. Good evening. Welcome to Crawley Borough Council's Licensing Committee meeting of the 9th of November 2020. I'm Councillor Jones, Chair of the committee. The agenda for this meeting is available on the Council's website. There are no in-person public speaking rights at this virtual meeting. However, members of the public have had the opportunity to submit written questions in advance of the meeting, which will be read by the Democratic Services Officer. Somebody's got their microphone on because I'm getting feedback. Is it possible to mute? Right. Before I invite members of the committee, can I ask the officers supporting the meeting to introduce themselves, giving their name and job title, please? Thank you.
Ms Matthews, Democratic Services Officer.
Jess Tamplin, Democratic Services Support Officer.
Kareem Plimpton, I'm the Licensing Manager, Team Leader for Health, Safety and Licensing. Good evening.
Hello, I'm Astrid Williams. I'm a Senior Solicitor employed by the Council. I'm the Legal Clerk for this evening.
Thank you. Before I invite members of the committee to confirm their attendance, I ask that they please ensure their mobile phones are switched off or on silent, their backgrounds are plain or nondescript, and that they will not be disturbed during the meeting. Committee members are reminded that they should have their microphones turned off unless speaking, and their cameras turned off unless speaking or requesting to speak. So we move on to the first item in the agenda, which is apologies for absence. Can I ask Jess, have we received any apologies for absence?
We've received apologies from Councillor Guider, Chair.
Thank you. Right, we will now take introductions with items 2 and 3. Please can I ask committee members when called upon to confirm the ward they represent, if they have any declarations of interest to make, and if they agree with the minutes of the meeting of the Licensing Committee held on the 15th of September 2020. Mayor, if I can pass that to you to go through the membership.
Okay. Could I ask Councillor Ayling to please turn her camera on?
Hello, I'm Councillor Marion Ayling. I'm a ward member for Bewbush and Bullfield North. I have no declarations of interest and I agree the minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Could Councillor Burgess please turn her camera on?
Hello, my name's Brenda Burgess. I'm Councillor for 3 Bridges and Town Centre, and I accept the minutes. And I have no declaration. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Crowe, could you please turn your camera on?
Good evening, I'm Councillor Duncan Crowe, representing Furnace Green, and I agree the minutes of the previous meeting.
Thank you. And Councillor Hart, could you please turn your camera on?
Good evening, I'm Councillor Julie Hart. I represent Ifield and Ifield West. I have no declarations of interest and I agree the minutes of the previous meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Jaggard.
Good evening, I'm Councillor Kim Jaggard from Maidenbower. I've got no declarations of interest and I agree the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Johans.
Good evening, Councillor Gwenda Johns, member for Northgate and West Green. I agree the minutes of the previous meeting and have no declarations of interest.
Thank you. Councillor Jones.
I'm Councillor Michael Jones. I represent the wards of Bewbush and Broadfield North. I have no declaration of interest to make, and I do agree the minutes of the meeting of the Licensing Committee held on the 15th of September 2020.
Thank you. Would Councillor McCarthy please turn your camera on?
You all right? So, do you want me to introduce myself?
If you could turn your camera on, please, then I can send you live.
it should be on. I'll turn it off and then back
Can't
on.
see, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, it's off and I'm
There we
back
go.
on again.
There we are.
Ah, fantastic. Councillor Kevin McCarthy from Poundhill, well, representing Poundhill North and Forge Wood. I have no declarations of interest and I agree with the minutes from the previous meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. And Councillor Miller-Smith, please turn your camera on.
Thank you. Councillor Jennifer Miller-Smith from Maidenbower Ward. I approve the minutes of the last meeting and I have no declarations of interest. And apologies, I'm a couple of minutes late getting online.
Thank you. And Councillor Mullins, would you please turn your camera on? There we go. If you could just unmute your microphone, Councillor Mullins.
Good to see. Old. I'm Councillor Chris Mullins from Gossip's Green in Broadfield North East. I agree the minutes. I've got no personal interest to declare.
Thank you. And Councillor Brenda Smith, if you could turn your camera on, please. Okay, if you just unmute yourself, please.
Better? Sorry.
That's it.
Brent Smith, councillor for Langley Green and Tushmore. I have no declarations of interest and I agree the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you. And just for transparency, we're expecting Councillor Richard Burrett to be on this call as well. He will be present in the meeting but has no speaking rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz. So it appears the committee agrees that the minutes of the meeting held on the 15th of September 2020 are an accurate record of the meeting. So move on to item 4, which is public question time. In line with the Council's Constitution, any questions from members of the public must have been received at least 2 days before the date of the meeting. Are there any questions for the committee?
We've received no questions from members of the public, Chair.
Thank you, Jess. In that case, we'll move on to item 5, which is obviously the main part of the business today, which is item 5 is the Department for Transport Statutory Taxi and Private Hire Standards Overview and Consultation. Can I ask Corinne Plimpton, who's the team leader for environmental health and licensing, to please introduce the report? Many thanks.
Good evening, Chair, members of the committee. Can I assume that you and your colleagues have read the report? That means I won't go through it verbatim. I'll do an executive summary, but obviously will be available for questions when you direct. Is that acceptable?
Yes, that's unless any member of the committee disagrees, I think that's fine. Thank you.
If I can take you to the report then, Chair, members of the committee, thank you. You'll be aware that the purpose of the report is to inform the Licensing Committee of the Department of Transport's recently published Statutory Taxi and Private Hire Standards, referred to in the report as the standards, published on the 21st of July this year. And those full standards are included at Appendix A. The standards themselves set out a range of robust measures to protect the private hire and hackney carriage passengers. The standards are designed to strengthen and improve the local authority's current policy and practices. It also sets out steps to help licensing authorities to work in partnership to ensure that public safety is the primary purpose of the licensing regime. As I've said previously, a copy of the standards is included at Appendix A, but also can be found in that particular link before you this evening. And the further purpose of the report is to seek your agreement to undertake a consultation exercise to raise the awareness of the standards and to seek views before proposing changes to the Council's policy as enshrined within the standards. Recommendations are included at section 2 of the report, and it's asked that you note the report, its contents and so on, particularly the standards as prescribed by the Department for Transport's document as of July this year, and that you authorise the Head of Community Services in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Environmental Services and Sustainability to undertake an exercise for a minimum of 4 weeks to raise the awareness of these statutory standards to both the trade and the wider public through the usual consultation mechanisms that we employ here at Crawley Borough Council. And furthermore, that the licensing committee note that a further report will be prepared for consideration by yourselves in the new year, which details the relevant responses to this consultation, along with the proposed changes to the council's current private hire and hackney carriage licensing policy to incorporate, where relevant, the new statutory standards, as well as the proposed implementation timetable to employ the same. As I've said previously, the reasons for the recommendation are included at section 3 of my report, and as experienced members of the licensing committee, you'll be aware that the primary purpose of the licensing regime is to protect the public safety. We currently license in the region of 780 vehicles and about 1,000 licensed drivers who must be fit and proper to hold a licence. We also license a range of private hire operators through whom private hire drivers source their work. The standards, as I've said previously, seeks to further boost the council's current private hire and hackney carriage licensing policy by placing a range of proposed measures on a national formal footing, and it expects us, the council as the licensing authority, to include the standards as part of the policy. The standards aim to promote passenger safety and to formalise information sharing arrangements and other mechanisms to improve overall standards within the trade itself. Section 4 provides you with the background. As you're aware, we've got an existing policy, which is referred to in the report as the policy, which was adopted in 2015. As you're aware, Appendix L, which relates to convictions, previous history and so on, was incorporated in 2019, and that's included at Appendix L. The policy itself also looks at other matters, including private hire and hackney carriage vehicles, private hire operators, vehicle proprietors, individual drivers, vehicle and driver standards, as well as wider compliance and enforcement matters. In terms of the requirements placed on the authority, Section 17 of the Police and Crime Act enables the Secretary of State to issue guidance to public authorities as to how their licensing functions under the taxi and private hire vehicle legislation may be exercised so as to protect children and vulnerable individuals who are over 18 from harm. And that's the primary purpose of the standards, is to protect the travelling public. As you're aware, as previously mentioned, the new statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards were brought to the attention of licensing authorities in July of this year, but we have been involved in extensive consultation and discussions surrounding these standards, both locally and nationally, with the relevant trade bodies. As I said, they're primarily concerned with safeguarding children and vulnerable adults. And there's now an expectation from a government point of view that local authorities will also work together to ensure, above all else, that the private hire and taxi regime protects public safety. And the Department for Transport has also stated that it will monitor licensing authorities' responses to the standards. Although it is aware of the current climate in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, it still expects local authorities to implement measures as have been set out in this policy standard. The Secretary of State has asked for that local authorities nationally do provide an update as to the implementation proposal as to the standards, namely by the 31st of January 2021. The DFT, Department for Transport, expects the recommendations to be fully implemented unless there is a compelling reason for not doing so. And obviously, as a local licensing committee, that's where your role will come in. As you're aware, under Section 177 of the Police and Crime Act, you'll have to have regard to the standards when exercising functions relating to taxi and private hire matters. It has also been declared in the interest of transparency that all licensing authorities have to publish their consideration of the measures enshrined within the standards, with such being included in the relevant taxi and private hire policy. That's the reason for it coming to your consideration today. We will be developing an outline delivery and implementation plan in due course after this initial consultation process, subject to you and your colleagues' approvals, Chair. The update will enable government bodies to monitor where we are as a local authority in comparison with others, and will also seek to question those local authorities who don't fully implement the standards as has been advised. And the document, it says, specifies that local authorities will have to explain a rationale for failing to act on the standards and include them. unless there is a compelling reason not to include them as part of the policy document. The taxi and licensing and private hire regime is somewhat dated, and the standards are seen as an important first step in reforming the way that taxis and private hire vehicles are managed and overseen, and try to ensure a consistency of standards amongst local authorities. There are quite wide regional differences between authorities, but I'm actually quite proud to say that Crawley Borough Council, as the licensing authority, does have one of the highest sets of standards that I've certainly seen within my career, and it's hopeful that those standards can continue. Section 5 provides you with a summary of the standards. We've already got a licensing policy, but this will need to be amended and revised to incorporate any standards that you as members of the licensing committee direct, as it may also involve the incorporation of additional conditions or revision of existing conditions. The fit and proper test, which is something that you and your colleagues will be aware of. Any licensed driver must be considered to be fit and proper to be a licensed driver, and this test should be based on the balance of probabilities and be proportionate. Applicants should not be given the benefit of the doubt, and if the panel is 50-50 as to whether an applicant is fit and proper, they should not be given a licence. We currently employ that mechanism when determining applications, and we look at the recommendations in terms of any criminal convictions, any other matters, and it's a civil process that we can consider in terms of the balance of probability, in terms of making a decision about whether or not an individual should be granted a licence. And as I've put here at 5.2, we've already been determining applications on the basis of the above recommendation for a considerable period. The amended Appendix L as part of the policy provides a further framework for decision-making processes, although of course each application needs to be considered on its merits. The administration process refers to training for members and training and awareness of staff. And there's already an existing scheme of delegation to allow for decisions to take place, along with mechanisms to determine more serious matters and proper training for members and officers to ensure that those decisions are reasonable, proportionate and justified. The standards are also recommending the inclusion of a whistleblowing mechanism for staff to call out concerns about procedures or other matters to ensure that cases are dealt with openly and fairly, and we already have that in place. So what you'll see in the report is I've put in bold where we are as an authority currently. And the next, perhaps most key and most interesting part of the standards relates to the provision of enhanced data DBS checks, criminal checks. Currently, we have a system whereby licensed drivers are checked at renewal or every 3 years, depending on however long their license is, in line with their renewal process. Conducting an enhanced DBS check every 6 months will increase the cost to drivers some sixfold to approximately £500 over 3 years if we stick with the current system. The current system is that a driver will contact us, will complete a paperwork-based system, and they pay on each occasion. We are looking to move towards the 6 monthly checks in conjunction with the standards, and we can go down that route because of an option to include ourselves on the update service, drivers on the update service. If incorporated into the council's policy, a requirement to evidence drivers' continuous subscription to this update service would need to be a condition of the licence. After applying for a DBS certificate, the driver would be subscribed to the service and nominate the licensing service as the authority that can view the status of their process and their certificate every day if needs be. So it gives us an automatic mechanism to check the suitability of an individual in the context of their DBS certificate, and it is an enhanced check for drivers. If there's new information on that certificate, the service is updated automatically and we would be notified of that, and a new certificate would be required. Currently, we have about 70 drivers who have subscribed to the update service, which costs about £13 a year. In normal terms, the enhanced DBS check under the current regime costs £40 and a standard check £23. This enhanced and the update service would need to be extended to all licensed drivers as appropriate to comply with the standards. And there are some exceptions there that I've included as a bullet point where they would not be suitable to be included as part of the update service. For example, if they're subject to a limited stay within the country or other reasons. Part 5.6 covers the issue of overseas convictions. We do have a number of drivers who come from other parts of the world and who then reside in the UK, and we're not able to do a full check. Currently, I'm proud to say that we already employ the mechanism that's being suggested there in the form of a production of the good conduct certificate. So if somebody hasn't resided in the UK for a period of time, or there's gaps in their history as to where they've resided and it's been abroad, we would ask for them to provide a certificate of good conduct from that country to ensure that they haven't come to notice for different, more nefarious reasons, i.e. they haven't secured a criminal conviction or similar. That process is already well established. The convictions policy at 5.7, I've already covered that as part of the Appendix L in our existing policy. We would have to update it so it broadly corresponds with the standards in their current form, but mostly our document is up to date and mirrors the Institute of Licensing document to which the Department for Transport refers. Notification of convictions for drivers. Currently, our drivers are required to notify us of any convictions, cautions, warnings and so on within 7 days. The standards are recommending a 48-hour turnaround, and this could be implemented by varying conditions of the licence in their entirety as part of the overhaul of our current policy. Criminality checks for vehicle proprietors, that's a new one, where drivers who own a plate, for example, a Hackney carriage plate, but don't drive that vehicle and aren't licensed as a driver, will now be subject to a basic disclosure check annually. So you'll see the current experience of where we are now. They don't currently get checked in any way, shape or form. They're not driving that vehicle, but what they do is they rent that vehicle out to a journeyman to allow that person to perhaps undertake work on their behalf, and they pay a fee to drive that vehicle. Under the new standards, it's a requirement or recommendation that vehicle proprietors do have a basic disclosure check. And again, once where that license is a limited company, all directors would be required to undergo a basic DBS check every 12 months. And if that changes, then that has to be done again and updated. 5.10 covers the duration of driver licenses. The standards recommend that it's automatically granted for 3 years. We do have that option already. Our licenses are granted between 1 and 3 years. Often it's at the choice of the driver that they license for a shorter period of time due to cost or personal circumstance. In some instances, there are circumstances where we would issue a license for a shorter period, but generally that's driven by an individual driver. In addition to that, we also carry out DVLA driving license checks quite regularly, once a year, sort of ad hoc and at the time of renewal, and this will often identify driving related convictions, and that process will continue. And as I've said to you previously, we already provide the option for individuals and operators to license for 1 to 3 years. Again, it's generally driven by an individual who specifies how long they want to license for. 5.11 covers the common or police disclosure and replaces the notifiable occupation scheme, and it gives you an overview there of when we would be notifying and working with the police, we would notify the police as a matter of course in any event, but this formalises the information sharing arrangements that were in place with other local authorities and with colleagues from the police service. Where a licence is revoked or refused on the grounds of public safety, the police are now informed as a matter of routine, as I've said. We do need to do some work at 5.12 with our involvement with the MASH, the Multi-Agency Safeguarding Hub, and I'm going to be working with our Community Services Manager about how we're going to implement that and put the recommendations forward in terms of wider safeguarding responsibilities for the council. Complaints against licensees, we already have a complaints process in place, and the current policy covers this. Further work is planned, however, to incorporate the recommendations of the standards, including the provision of a sticker or similar into a vehicle where the passenger can feed back to the council about a vehicle driver or operator, perhaps both from a negative perspective and from a positive perspective, but those ideas are currently being scoped. Mandatory safeguarding awareness training, a very key element of this is recommended within the standards. Currently, we have had some drivers who've gone through training using the NSPCC, and we're currently working with other local authorities and exploring a range of different approaches as to the design and delivery of safeguarding training, county lines and child sexual exploitation training. As I've said, we're already in discussions with training providers to incorporate this, as well as West Sussex County Council and Sussex Police for their expertise to, as part of the kind of licensing process, both for new and existing drivers to raise awareness. And we will also be incorporating safeguarding questions into the knowledge test to test that awareness and understanding of those key elements. The 5.15 gives you an overview of the English assessment that it specifies that all drivers should be able to converse with passengers to understand destination and estimates of time, along with other common features such as change, receipts and so on. And again, in conjunction with the safeguarding training, we're looking at that borough-wide and with other neighbouring authorities about whether we can adopt some kind of consistency of approach, both with safeguarding training and with an English test standard. Some authorities do already have an English test standard, but the requirements vary massively, and we're looking to try and ensure that it's reasonable, proportionate and appropriate for our trade. 5.16 covers the aspect of enforcement. Joint enforcement arrangements are already in place. We do have some officers that are already authorised across Sussex, and we've just formulated, at my suggestion, an East and West Sussex taxi liaison group with neighbouring officers to ensure that there's consistency of practice, better information sharing, joint authorisation, which should help us from an enforcement point of view. Essentially, it means that other officers can enforce against our drivers and we can enforce against their drivers if they come into our area and cause a particular problem. We've also used other licensing officers in the past to facilitate with joint enforcement operations, for example, test purchasing, or where we've got a complaint about a particular driver not offering appropriate customer service or not behaving appropriately. And we also have already got existing working relationships with Sussex Police to facilitate information exchange and a consistency of approach. In terms of wider enforcement, it's something we're looking at more consistently about what form of conditions may be appropriate, what would accord with the standards and what we've got currently. Again, I'm very proud to say that Crawley is one of the market leaders in terms of our vehicle standards, our conditions and our requirements in terms of making sure that our drivers are fit and proper. 5.17 touches briefly on suspension and revocation, and the guidance clarifies situations where revocations and suspensions may be used. Generally, this authority does have those two options, and revocations are generally used for serious matters or repeat offences, but again, each case is considered on its merits. On occasion, we do suspend licences, for example, because of medical reasons or because there isn't sufficient information relating to a licensing process. 5.18, private hire operators and criminal record checks. Currently, our private hire operators do undergo DBS checks, but an extension to this is included with the in the standards is that all staff who have access to booking records and who take bookings should also be DBS checked. So that's going to be quite an interesting mechanism that we'll need to review. It is our experience that some people who may have been refused a licence for not being fit and proper do often revert to being call handlers. So that's going to present some challenges, I would imagine, and it'll be an interesting process should you and your colleagues consider that's an appropriate mechanism. But it is recommended within the standards that is a requirement. And bear in mind there that lots of call handlers have access to sensitive information, for example, a passenger's destination, their phone numbers and so on. So it's only right and proper that they are properly checked also. 5.19 covers the aspect of record keeping, and I'd like to reassure you that the current conditions that are on licences regarding record keeping for our operators broadly covers those matters covered A to E. We may need to tweak them slightly to bring them up to date, but broadly they're already in place to make sure that we can get a full record of what journeys have been undertaken, where, when and by whom, and that has proved to be incredibly helpful in the case of complaints, issues or concerns surrounding the conduct of a driver. 5.20 relates to CCTV in vehicles, and the standards look at the issue of mandatory CCTV, and The paragraph underneath wishes to advise you that currently CCTV is not mandatory in our licensed vehicles, but it is employed on an ad hoc basis. It is also seen as a valuable tool in keeping both drivers and passengers safe. As I've said, our current CCTV conditions are attached on a case-by-case basis. For example, if we've had a particular problem with a driver with regard to their conduct, and many licensed drivers do actually opt to install CCTV for their own safety as well. The licensing committee, you and your colleagues will be aware, has previously indicated that it supports the use of CCTV as a mandatory condition within the context of licensed vehicles. And we would need to sort of update those conditions and requirements to ensure that they accurately reflect technological advances and evidential standards required by the police, to make sure that those items and imagery are included appropriately. Obviously, there are some challenges around the CCTV in terms of data controller, and it is recommended within the standards that not only does the CCTV have a pictorial recording image, but it also allows for panic buttons, which can be activated by both passengers and by the driver in the event of a difficulty. So again, that's something that will need to be explored carefully. 5.21 covers the issue of local consultation, which is what we already do. We consult widely, and that's what we're asking here to do today as part of the report. And we have an established corporate consultation process that we generally follow. Changes to policies, which we've talked about as well. And this policy and standards will need to be incorporated as you see fit as the licensing committee. And it's the issue of stretch limousines. We don't currently license those in the borough. We don't necessarily have the appropriate garages to do that, but they would be considered. And in section 6 of the report covers the issue of the Department of Transport, and section 7, the key actions that are arising. So they relate to the signing up of the National Licensing Database, to share information regarding revoked or refused licenses, referred to as the NR3 database. We're already part of it as an authority, but this places it on a formal footing. Driver enhanced DBS checks every 6 months, which is a move away from the 1 to 3 years, depending on how long a license is issued for. And it has implications for officer time as well as license holders. And you've seen that it's a cheaper but equally effective mechanism, and we already have a proportion of our drivers who subscribe to that service. Safeguarding awareness, child exploitation and county lines training, that's already being explored. We're looking at service providers, and we're looking to incorporate some conditions surrounding the same in our knowledge test to ensure that our drivers are fully aware. And it is particularly pertinent given our proximity to the airport and the fact that we do have a number of people coming from different backgrounds into the Crawley Borough. And obviously that will impact on council officers and prospective or current licence holders, as the proposal is to have those elements of training incorporated for new drivers, as well as upgrading the skills and skill set of our existing drivers as appropriate. The DBS checking and frequencies for private hire, booking and dispatch staff and proprietors has also been mentioned. CCTV as another key element as well. Joint enforcement powers, which I've talked about extensively in relation to other districts and boroughs, and I myself am authorised in neighbouring authorities, but we're looking to do it as a Sussex-wide strategy so that all licensing officers are covered to carry out enforcement activities, which hopefully will involve better use of time, better targeting of resources, and greater expertise and knowledge. And 7.7 covers the review of the policy itself to incorporate the standards as it may be considered necessary, and this is a significant piece of work that will require further consultation. Section 8 covers the financial implications, licensing as a self-financing service, and Section 9 covers the legal implications there for you. I appreciate that's quite a lengthy overview, but given the significance of the standards and the impact it will have in terms of promoting public safety, I felt it was appropriate to take you and your colleagues through that, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think that's been very helpful indeed. Thank you. The process for discussion at this meeting will be as follows. Any committee member wishing to speak should turn on their camera. This will signify to the Democratic Services Officer your request to speak. You'll then be invited to speak one by one. When you're called on, please unmute your microphone and check that you're surrounded by a red box before speaking. Please turn off your camera and microphone when you've finished and are no longer live. Officers will respond to any queries raised after each committee member has spoken. However, what I'm going to do here is if your question is on the same subject area as the previous questioner, can you indicate so we can address those issues together? I think that might be more straightforward. And if there are linked questions, I might take several together rather than one at a time. Is that clear to everyone? Right, thank you. In that case, let's start with the first person, Mez. Yeah. Who would
Councillor Ayling.
Marion.
Thank you. Yeah, my question is, do the taxi drivers have to put a sign in their taxi to say that there's CCTV in there and that it will be filming? Thank you.
I'll bring Karine back to answer that.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, Councillor Ayling, there are a range of matters that the authority will need to consider if it does go down the route of mandatory CCTV, in terms of advising those travelling in vehicles, yes, that CCTV is in operation, who is going to be the data controller and so on, and the standard of the CCTV. So yes, it will have to be clearly available and visible to those people being transported in those licensed vehicles that CCTV is in operation. And if the authority considers it's appropriate as part of the process to install the use of panic buttons, because currently a lot of the CCTV doesn't have any audio, the use of panic buttons will also be clearly marked.
Okay, thank you. That was my other question. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marion. While we're on this subject of CCTV, does anyone wish to raise a question relating to that as well? If you do, can you indicate? I'm not seeing anyone.
Michael?
Here. Oh, Kevin, sorry.
Yeah, well, just on CCTV, I'm a little bit confused with the report. So, I mean, on section 5.2, we say CCT is not mandatory, but in 7.5, we're saying CCT as a mandatory requirement. So, it's not mandatory at the moment. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, the plan is to make it mandatory in the future.
Karine, do you want to answer that?
Yes, thank you. That's one of the proposals as the standards, that CCTV, both imagery and audio, is made mandatory. So that's something that you'll be needing to consider as a committee in due course, yes.
I think there are several options relating to what CCTV is deployed and whether audio is part of it. That's where the panic button issue comes in. But right, any other questions relating to CCTV, or are we finished on that area now? Yeah, thank you. Not seeing anyone else. Mez, next question.
Okay, so Councillor Crowe.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. This report does seem very sensible to me. Certainly we as councillors, the public themselves, and of course the taxi and private hire vehicle trade, I would have thought that public safety is prominent for all of us, quite honestly. I see that we're being asked to note this report. Well, obviously we will, and also note that a further report will be coming forward following the consultation. Yes, absolutely note that as well. I've got two questions. The first one relates to the consultation itself. Consultations around the taxi trade are somewhat new to me, as it happens. So forgive me, my question seemed a little bit naive, but I'm curious as to who would be expected to respond to this. I would presume we would want a wide response with the public and indeed the trade. But do our consultations tend to find that we do get a much greater number of drivers responding than members of the public? So I just leave that floating there. And then if I just on another area, overseas convictions is rightly highlighted, and the difficulty that we can have as a local authority in ascertaining whether anybody would have any, and noting that we do have a lot of drivers who do originate from abroad. But also it's worth remembering that some of our taxi drivers also spend considerable time a period abroad whilst they currently live here as well. so we shouldn't forget that. But really a simple question, as well as requiring a good character reference, do we not do some Google searches just to sort of make sure, you know, I appreciate it's not infallible, but it's another tool that we could be using as a local authority just to do some checks. And I do appreciate that sometimes some names are common, but you never know. Put it this way, the flip side of it would be that if it was something that was very obvious to find via the internet, and something emerged further down the line, it would look bad for the authority, wouldn't it? So I trust we do use the internet to assist us in our searches for taxi drivers who have been removed recently from abroad or who do spend considerable parts of the year out there.
Corinne?
Thank you. Perhaps if I can address the first mechanism, the consultation in relation to the standards is 4 weeks minimum in the first instance to raise the profile of the standards. The trade have been aware of the DFT standards looming, shall we say, for some considerable time. The consultation process will be on our council's consultation website. And you're quite right, Councillor. Yes, we do tend to get a higher proportion of responses when it involves members of the trade. This at this stage is merely to bring it to their attention, bring it onto their radar once again. And that's why the consultation period is for a shorter period than usual. The compact is normally 12 weeks. We'll be doing a further consultation period once we are further down the line, once you and your colleagues indicate that you're happy for matters to go forward. And there'll be a full consultation if there are revisions to practice, procedure, licence conditions and so on, and that's probably when you'll have the most amount of feedback. In relation to the second point about good character and overseas, that's precisely the point of having the 6 monthly DBS checks, because that was picked up as a key issue by other members of the licensing authority and nationally as a particular problem. When we do good character checks, can I say that we do a range of checks with our neighbouring authorities. That's the provision of the NR3 database, so that actually if someone's been refused a licence, I don't know, for example in Liverpool, that would be updated on the NR3 database. There's not a national database currently, so you might find out by accident sometimes that someone's been refused a licence elsewhere because they haven't always told us the truth on their application form. But we do employ a range of mechanisms, and the police is part of what was previously known as the notifiable occupation scheme. So if someone's been naughty during the currency of holding a licence, then we would normally get to hear about it. But also you'd be surprised how many licensed drivers tell us about anything that somebody may or may not have been involved in. So there are a range of opportunities that we exploit as fully as we're able to within the legal parameters to do a check on an individual and to share information both with Sussex Police, immigration and neighbouring authorities as is appropriate. And I'm hopeful that the new standards will create a more consistency of practice, because there are sometimes gaps in other authorities about how they check somebody, or they may grant a licence that we as the licensing authority here at Crawley would not entertain, because we have a more robust mechanism, for example, where there's a previous conviction or a history. So yes, there are a range of mechanisms employed to check an individual. And it's hopeful that the NR3 system, the nationalised database, which all licensing authorities should be populating, will help in that endeavour to ensure that our drivers are fit and proper and meet the required standards as is necessary. Generally, we find out where there's a will, there's a way, and we do lots of different checks and get feedback, Councillor, yes. Obviously, it's got to be legal and proportionate.
Thanks. Can I just add, Chairman, if I may? Thank you, Corinne, for your responses to both questions, which answered them very fully. And just to add that I'm very happy to support all the recommendations.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I absolutely. The consultation. I think it's worth pointing out. Isn't just with the taxi trade. It is a public consultation of which the trade is a part. And I would emphasise to any members of the public who might be watching this, or indeed, councillors as well, everybody, residents in the borough, everyone should feel that they can share their views on what's going out, because we genuinely want to know how this is going to be. And obviously, it depends on the consultation who responds the most. I think it's fair to say. I think in the past when we had the accessible wheelchair consultation, we got a lot of public representations, but then we've had other ones. I think Corinne will agree with me where, you know, not so much from the public, but possibly more from the trade. Does anyone want to ask any further questions on the consultation side of things? Chris, I see you're waving your hand. Is it? Yep.
I was just sort of waiting my turn really, but what I was thinking about while we were going through this was that it seems to me at last we might have, and I'm hoping I'm right in reading it this way, a national standard for private hire and for hackney carriages. What I can't quite understand at the moment is if we're going out to consultation and people will be putting their opinions back to us on various sections of this. If we decide that something is reasonable and we might wish to change it, what is the mechanism for it? Or if we can do things locally to this policy, then we don't have a national standard. So what I'm getting at is, do we feed back any views nationally to the Department of Transport or wherever, and then they make up the final document, which is then implemented across the whole of the nation? Or do we end up with local amendments still, which will give us a variance, which I think would make this not as good, because I think we do need national standards. That's the sort of thoughts I was having about that. The bit about it's whether the people, I know we assume we've got the joint working between East and West Sussex, but the big problem and the complaints we get from the taxi drivers generally are the sort of visitors from out of town, the Ubers and other people that, you know, come into town. How does this control those people and those drivers and their systems? Because that, I mean, if this comes in and we have got very good standards here, but this actually enhances them from there, as far as I can see, and makes things of a higher standard and safer. So I'd be supporting it. But in terms of how it sits with the drivers and how that sits with them as far as drivers from other areas coming in, particularly from London or the outskirts of London, and whether it controls Uber and the antics they get up to, because there's been a number of court cases about these people, and how do we control those? So, I mean, has the Department of Transport dealt with all of these issues? That's really what my question is.
Yeah, I've been very lenient with you there, Chris. That wasn't a question on the consultation process. But if you want to answer that, Corinne, if anyone has questions on what Councillor Mullins has just raised as well, if you could appear. I see Kim has appeared, so I'm guessing it's linked. But if Corinne, you want to answer that first, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, perhaps if I can take the first point, which was a discussion, if I'm right, in relation to the standards and localised matters. The statutory standards that have been defined in the report for you and that form part of the statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards is a minimum standard, Councillor, that all local authorities hopefully will sign up or have to sign up to, or give good reason why they're not going to sign up to it. It's a bit like the Licensing Act 2003. We have Section 182 guidance that when you're making your licensing decisions, you have to refer back to that guidance and give reasons as to why you may deviate from that guidance. It's a similar principle here. So it's looking to create those minimum standards, perhaps in other authority areas where they haven't got the high standards that we've got in Crawley, but also to supplement those to create a consistency of approach and a minimum standard expectation. If we want to exceed those minimum standards, which we are in some areas, then so be it. But the minimum is specified within those statutory taxi and private hire standards. Hopefully that covers that question. And the issue of other, it's hoped that basically those standards will help us to work collectively as licensing officers and licensing authorities to squeeze out those businesses, operators, individuals that are a problem, that aren't meeting the required standards, and to give us a consistency of approach more generally to manage the whole licensing regime, which is a bit hit and miss at the moment. I think it's fair to say the legislation is somewhat antiquated. This is looking to bring some of those important mechanisms that I've detailed this evening into line with modern technology, with new approaches as things develop in light of various safeguarding concerns that have been identified, CSE and so on. So it's about creating a benchmark minimum standard, and if we exceed that minimum benchmark standard, then that's so much the better, because the primary purpose of the licensing regime, and this is something I'm absolutely passionate about, is the travelling public. The trade themselves are important in terms of meeting those standards, but the whole purpose of the licensing regime is about public safety. So yes, it's just it's creating that minimum standard that everyone has to adhere to, or give reasons as to why not if they're not going to adhere to those minimum standards, but looking to go above and beyond those minimum standards. Hopefully that answers the question. A bit full there, but quite an impassioned view.
Michael, you're on mute.
Hello, is that better? Yes, sorry, thank you. As Corinne was saying, it's still our local policy, but if we want to deviate, or we want to say that there are good reasons, they've got to be the compelling reasons that Corinne was referring to earlier on, and we've got to be able to justify it as a council to the Department for Transport. Just on the other thing you raised, Chris, look, the cross-border thing is a huge issue. It's been a huge issue for years. It's a little beyond our control, in the sense that to go back to what we used to have, which I look back on with great nostalgia, that we could enforce everything quite strictly across the borough boundary. It would require a change in national law. The Deregulation Act, which was back in 2012 or thereabouts, I think, literally drove a coach and horses through the arrangements. And one of the things I'd like to say, I think, is a really good idea, that this proposed joint Sussex approach, the group of officers that are getting together, I think this is actually a really good and practical way to address some of the issues that have arisen. But clearly, I think we still need to put some pressure, I think, as a council on the government to listen to all the concerns, and they've been around for a long time about the cross-border issues. And I know we've certainly had a bit of we've had a bit of local attention on that recently as well in some of its manifestations. But yes, any other questions?
Michael, can I just? Can I just carry on with this discussion a second?
Yeah.
What I was trying to get to, will the Uber type organisations come under these controls? That's what I was really trying to get clarified, because their standards have not been met. Their driver standards have not been met. They don't do the testing and inquiries that are normally done. And any old Tom, Jack and Harry can seem to ride around in a car, and somebody phones from their mobile and gets a cab turned up and pick them up somewhere. And there doesn't seem to be any control on those people. And it wouldn't be fair for taxi and private hire people who are registered, and we recognise, for them to be put at a disadvantage to those companies. And that's what the big bone of contention is. And that's what I was trying to get clear in my head.
Do you want to comment on that, Corinne?
Thank you. I think it's important not to get too tied down to specific operators. What I would say is that a number of operators who have an app-based system, there are some who are regulated by the Department for Transport, Transport for London, sorry, Freudian slip there, Transport for London and the Public Carriage Office, and providing a trio of licences in place. Their activity under the auspices of cross-border hiring is legitimate and appropriate and lawful. There is a lobbying campaign to by this authority and other authorities to close the loophole that is presented in relation to cross-border hiring, but in its current form it is lawful and it is legal, albeit frustrating for some of the licensed drivers, but it's a national problem. It's a legislative issue, not a local issue. But the implementation of the statutory minimum standards does set a benchmark within which the licensed trade and licensing authorities work towards to create minimum standards. Some app-based operators are going through the required vetting processes in terms of enhanced checks, and the process that they're following is the same or similar to our own licensed drivers. The cross-border hiring angle I've kind of mentioned in passing, and I don't think it's necessarily helpful to kind of labour the point in relation to that, but in its current form, it is lawful and it is a national legislative issue, not one that the authority can control directly.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to move on because I think Kevan McCarthy has got some questions to ask on this. Kevan?
Yeah, a couple of questions I'd like to ask. The first one, whilst I appreciate that we already had pretty high standards prior to this legislation coming forward, can you tell me where our standards were lacking slightly and where this legislation has the biggest impact? I'm actually sort of asking for an executive summary, if you like. That's the first question. The second question, when we talk about passenger safety, we talked about CCTV within the vehicle. I think that's only one of the data streams we could capture. We could do other data recording, i.e. the vehicle speed and the vehicle's position, like GPS position and things like that. Has that been considered? And could we consider having a speed overlay on top of the video feed, for instance, to address any arguments a passenger might have that the driver was driving dangerously?
Corinne? Yep. Did you want to?
Thank you. Yes. In relation to the first point, actually, the executive summary, the key actions at section 7 of my report kind of give you the executive key points that we need to address as an authority. So in general, it relates to the increased frequency of the DBS check-in, the sharing of information, joint authorisation of officers, and inclusion on the NR3 database. We are doing that currently, but we'll need to extend the provisions there. It's not just about it, revocations and suspensions, it's about other aspects of activity as well, that where a driver may have come to notice, and the inclusion of safeguarding training, which we have had in the past, but formalising that and putting that on a condition footing, the use of English tests and other things, and potentially overhauling our current arrangements in terms of wheelchair accessible vehicle training as well, the checking of proprietors and call handling staff, for want of a better word. That's not in place at the moment. The CCTV one, which we've discussed already. Some vehicles do already have the CCTV system, and on occasion where we have a driver that has been convicted for penalty points for speeding or other driving offences, shall we say, we have put individual conditions on requiring a system to be installed to monitor their driving ability, to monitor their speeding and so on. But there are some fairly technical systems out there at the moment. We'll be looking at a range of options available to the committee, be it through the CCTV, be it through driver checking and so on. But we also need to make sure that we're acting legally and proportionately in response to any concerns. But we do already have that mechanism in place where we put individual conditions on drivers for CCTV, or for something called a driver angel, so that it keeps a monitor on what they're doing and when, where we've had a particular problem. And it might be that's rather than a en masse agreement, that's a continuation of that approach. So those mechanisms are available.
A sort of tachograph in the old in the old world, if you like.
Well, may I come back on that?
Please do. Sorry. Yes.
It's just, we need to make sure that we're acting reasonably proportionally and appropriately when we're considering mechanisms to track and manage drivers' behaviours. I absolutely agree with you in what you're saying, Councillor, but it's important that we do that with the appropriate checks and balances in place, that it's a reasonably proportionate and an appropriate mechanism. At one stage, there was a suggestion of tachographs in licensed vehicles. That hasn't been pursued. The requirement to produce receipts on every single journey, again, that has been explored previously as well. that hasn't been pursued, but there are a range of mechanisms that the authority can employ as part of and in supplement to the vehicle standards that have been outlined to you this evening to better support and manage the journeys that people are undertaking, both from a driver experience point of view and from a passenger point of view, underpinned, of course, by public safety.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevan. Anything further, or are you happy with those? Thank you. I mean, I just want to stress, and I'm not suggesting anyone said this here, but I wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong idea. Actually, we've got a very proud record at the borough on our standards in terms of taxi licensing, you know, and indeed licensing in general, you know, sort of, and we do compare, and we have historically compared very favourably indeed with many local authorities, not just but locally, but across the country. So, yeah, that's great. Brenda, you're on. You've appeared, so I'm guessing you'd like to ask a question. Please do.
If that's possible, please. Just to
Absolutely.
clarify, I think this is an excellent piece of work, by the way, you've done. But I just want to clarify this idea of training. Is it 5.3 training for those making license decisions, and also training for taking place of training providers. You're discussing already with training providers for training for, is that the taxi people themselves or the taxi companies? Is this in-house, or is this for us in-house, and for the taxi people, is it a provider? What I'm asking you how this is going to take place. Basically, I'm not doing it very well. Sorry.
Corinne, would you like to answer that? Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor, we're exploring a range of options at the moment. It's most likely going to be an external training provider. We're looking at whether it's appropriate to deliver training face-to-face to drivers, whether that's done online, remotely, and we are working with neighbouring authorities, in fact Sussex-wide, to look at a standardised approach to that training, so that we have a minimum standard, certainly Sussex-wide, for safeguarding, for CSE training, for similar things, to make sure that that standard is met. And we'll be doing supplementary testing of that within the context of our knowledge tests, which both private hire vehicle drivers and Hackney carriage drivers do have to undertake as part of that. Where we've got established licensed drivers, we may implement that as part of their renewal process or require that they undertake it within a prescribed timescale. But we are looking at a range of delivery options at the moment, but the most favourable and potentially the most appropriate is through an outsourced company who have the specific accreditations and the specific skill set and knowledge and awareness, in conjunction with Sussex Police, to deliver those training needs, shall we say. So there will be an additional cost associated with that, but I'm working hard to look at the most competitive and most appropriate method of service delivery, but also being mindful that it needs to be fit for purpose and appropriate to deliver those key elements which are fundamental to the role of a taxi driver. And by taxi driver, I mean both Hackney carriage and private hire drivers.
Thank you. Brenda, did you want to come back? Yep.
And for those who, like ourselves, those making the licensing decisions, I presume our training is in-house as we normally do it. So that's all right. I think that's it. Thank you, Michael. Very good. Excellent piece of work, as I said. Well done.
Absolutely. I'll share your view on that, Brenda. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Burgess. Any other questions? Nobody is appearing. Chris? Councillor Mullins?
Just one quick clarification. This is going out for consultation for 4 weeks, and there may be further consultation. So there's a lot of consultation associated with this. But I think, Corinne, you said that this was a minimum standard document. So what I assume from that is that we cannot go below the standards set in this document. So even if after the consultation takes place and the taxi drivers, for example, come back with another point of view, if it waters down any of these paragraphs, it cannot be accepted. So all we can get from the taxi drivers or the general public is an enhancement of these standards, which we can accept. Am I clear in understanding that? Because it does mean that the consultation in itself, is really quite limited in a way, because there's very little amendments can be made. So we can only amend it upwards to enhance the standards, and we can't lower it if this is minimum standards.
I think that's probably a matter for us in the final decision. I mean, tell me if I'm got this wrong. As I said earlier on, if anyone doesn't like anything that's proposed, and it's part of that standard, they've got to provide compelling reasons why we shouldn't meet that standard, would be my answer. But obviously I'll be guided by the officers on this. So it is not something where we are saying to people, you haven't got any say in this whatsoever. It's this or better. I don't think it is a challenge for us as a council to actually come up with our own local standards, which are which also we can actually justify to the government. I think is the way I see it. But I'll let Corinne come in a moment, and I see you there, Jennifer, and I'll let you in shortly after. Thank you, and Brenda. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. This first phase of consultation is to bring the matter to the fore. That's why it's a short, quick time consultation, because broadly the licensed trader are already aware of the standards that are being proposed, but it's to bring it to the fore to highlight the importance of it to both the trade and the travelling public. This is essentially a matter that the authority is considering bringing it to the fore. It is a set of sort of basic standards, and we, as an authority, if you as members decide that you don't want to implement a key part of the standards, then we need to be able to robustly defend that to the Department of Transport as to why the authority is not looking to implement that as a mechanism, and we'll need to think of clear and careful reasons as to why certain aspects may or may not be incorporated. So this first phase is a quick time consultation, bringing it onto the agenda to say to the travelling public and the trade, these standards are coming to the fore. The local authority is considering them as the licensing authority. Then we will come back to you in the new year with any feedback arising from that consultation exercise. But in addition to that, putting forward some proposed revisions and or changes to incorporate the standards as you and your colleagues see fit, including a form of words or revisions to the policy itself, which again then can be potentially consulted on or debated in that arena. But that's something for the new year. This is a quick time consultation to bring it to the fore and raise the profile of those proposed standards, which are a basic standard. And if we don't adhere to those or adopt those, we need to have a very robust approach as to why not, and a very good reasoning behind that. And that's the inference and what is stated in the standards document.
Thank you. Councillor Miller-Smith.
Thank you. I think Corinne actually probably have slightly covered some of the things I was thinking about, but I just wanted to check, along with what you've just said, the 31st of January next year, is that when we have to have sort of updated this finally, or is it, you were describing this, so we still have time to sort of be, by then we just have to be sort of showing a direction we're going in effectively? Is that correct?
Corinne,
thank you. Sorry, I was just waiting to be sent live there. It's basically from the 31st of January, you need to be able to give the Department for Transport a clear steer of where the authority is, a potential implementation timescale, and the areas within which the authority has determined to implement and potentially adopt, to show a process of implementation. So the 31st is the first date of asking us where we are, and obviously we'll be mid-consultation, or hopefully have completed the consultation process by then, and it may be back before you. I'm not quite sure of the timescales of the next licensing committee, but it may be that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to bring the standards up to some aspects of our policy up to the required standards. We will be working with key representatives of the trade, and I will be emailing people to advise them that consultation's live as is appropriate. And we'll also be doing some things on Twitter and Facebook to raise the profile of the consultation. It is just an information raising exercise as part of the consultation. The more significant stuff, if you like, will be from the new year, but as long as we can provide the Department for Transport with an implementation timetable or reasons why we are or are not adopting elements of the standards, that's what's expected. And I think we would have been in a different position had we not had COVID-19. There may have been a quicker expectation to implement things more fully by the 31st of January, but there needs to be some careful consultation, some careful consideration of what are some fairly significant issues before full adoption.
Thank you. That's great. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Councillor Miller-Smith. Any other questions? Doesn't look like it. I'll one last call for questions, and then I'll move on to the to the recommendations. Yep, all committee members have had the opportunity to speak, so we'll move on to the recommendations. A recorded vote on the application will be taken by the Democratic Services Officer. Members of this committee will be called upon to vote in alphabetical order. Once you are live, please unmute your microphone, ensure your camera is on, and state whether you are for or against the recommendations or if you abstain. Don't forget to leave a few seconds once you've turned your microphone on for it to start working. Right, the recommendations are 2.1, that the committee notes the report and the attached Appendix A. 2.2, that the committee authorises the Head of Community Services, in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Environmental Services and Sustainability, to undertake a consultation exercise for a minimum of 4 weeks in order to raise awareness of the Department for Transport's statutory taxi and private hire vehicle standards. 2.3, that the Licensing Committee notes that a further report will be prepared for consideration at the Licensing Committee in the new year, which details the relevant responses to this consultation, along with the proposed changes to the Council's private hire and hackney carriage licensing policy to incorporate the new statutory standards, as well as a proposed implementation timetable to comply with the same. As recommendations 2.1 and 2.3 request the committee solely notes an item, I propose that the committee takes one vote on all three recommendations together. If any committee member disagrees with this approach, please indicate now by turning your camera on.
There's no
I think we've given enough time for people to switch their cameras on. I will therefore move the recommendations together. Please note that this does not necessarily indicate my support, nor that of the Vice Chair, for the recommendations themselves. But can I ask the Vice Chair to second, Councillor Mrs. Burgess?
Yes, I second it, Councillor Jones.
Thank you. Therefore, will the Democratic Services Officer please conduct the recorded votes?
Okay, so this is a recorded vote on agenda item 5. Committee members are asked to vote for, against or to abstain on all three recommendations, which will be taken together as a whole. Please ensure that your video feed is live before declaring your vote. Councillor Railings.
For.
Councillor Burgess.
For.
Councillor Crowe.
Agreed.
Councillor Hart.
For.
Councillor Jaggard.
For.
Councillor Johns.
For.
Councillor Jones.
For.
Councillor McCarthy, could you please turn your camera on? Thank you. Councillor McCarthy. Sorry, your microphone.
Kevin.
For. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Miller-Smith.
4, thank you.
And Councillor, oh. Councillor Mullins.
4.
And Councillor Smith.
4.
Lovely, thank you. So the vote has been taken with 11 votes for, 0 votes against and 0 abstentions on the recommendation. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, Ms. The committee has voted for the recommendations set out in report HCS 22. Looking at the next item on the agenda is the supplemental agenda. There is no business in the there is no supplemental agenda. Therefore, with the business of the licensing committee meeting concluded, the meeting is now closed at 2016. I shall be signing the minutes of the last meeting later. I'm afraid you won't be able to share the magic with me, councillors, but thank you very much for your participation today. And I think it's been an excellent meeting.
It has. And can we minute our thanks to all those involved in bringing this forward? Yeah,
fully agree. And now we will go at some point in the near future. We will go out to consultation, and we will
yes,
we will meet again and have a report on the responses.
Excellent.
Thank you very much indeed,
Well
councillors,
done.
and see
Mike.
everyone soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Night.
Good night.